Okay, so welcome to everybody. We're pleased again to have with us well-known physicist, Dr. Jeremy England, who was a professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Dr. England.
Thanks very much. So the timing of the topic of this shiur would be better without the extra month of Adar that we have this year, because it's connected with what we read for Parshat Shkalim, usually right before Purim. And we're not quite as close to Purim as we otherwise might be, but all the more time to think about Parshat Shkalim and counting people and censai and plagues and other things in the interim. Because I think at any rate, for other reasons, it's kind of hard to make the subject we have planned not topical in an era of lengthy pandemic social fluctuation and sometimes paralysis. And so I want to start off by coming from kind of an unconventional direction, or maybe it's predictable given my background as a physicist, but it will eventually, I hope, make some amount of sense and be connected with the sources that I want to land on. So before we dive straight into the sources, I'll start with a broad kind of question, which is, do we think that measuring things can affect the things that are measured? And ask that as kind of a commonsensical question, because there are two kinds of reactions I think people could have to that kind of contemplation. One would be to react to it as a question about the everyday experience of the human being. And then I think it's sort of obvious that there's all sorts of situations in which observing or measuring things can affect them. For example, especially with human beings, if people know they're being watched or know they're being observed or know they're being assessed in a certain way, they will behave differently. And their differences in behavior will have concrete outcomes that are also measurable, right? That if you put a traffic camera somewhere, perhaps, then maybe fewer people are likely to run through a red light, et cetera. And so those are clear instances. Sometimes though, to the ear of a certain person, if you say, can measuring things affect them, then they'll want to go all the way to the other extreme and talk about modern physics, right? And talk about quantum mechanics and say, oh, well, we've heard about things like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, or we've heard about things like wave particle duality and all these rarefied ideas that come from, let's say, the translation of the mathematics of quantum mechanics into semi-intuitive sort of stories that we tell about the math. And so what are some examples there? Well, perhaps the most famous is the idea, as I mentioned, of the uncertainty principle, which is, for example, if you have a particle like an electron and you try to measure how fast it's moving and in what direction, or if you try to measure where it is, that you can get information about both of those things, but your attempts to make one of those measurements very precise will set fundamental limits on how precisely you can measure the other one. And so the more you can localize something to exactly where it is, the harder it is to tell exactly how fast it's moving and to set up a measurement that can really show you that accurately, or vice versa. The more you try to very accurately measure how fast in what direction something is moving, the more you're going to run into trouble exactly localizing where it is. And those kinds of statements are not ones that we think of as really applying to the objects or the matter of everyday life. It's something that reared its head when physicists started looking at the world through devices that could break the world into very tiny little pieces and look at them each separately and really almost failing to separate them actually from each other to some degree because of other quantum effects that also reared their head. So which thing are we talking about here? If I pose the question this way, because what we're going to get into is the first source is about taking a census, which is counting people. And the question perhaps of whether counting people can somehow put them in danger and whether the Torah is hinting at that. And I don't think that we should, in one sense, be thinking about this as a quantum mechanical question, but I can't resist as an aside, or let's say as a preamble, starting off by pointing out, and one could do a whole longer shiur about this, which I'd love to get into at some point. I think that there are a lot of things that in the present day people talk about as the mystifying discoveries of quantum theory, which totally upended everyone's understanding of what the world is and how it works, where at the level of the philosophical problems that quantum mechanics is supposed to raise, really what happened was that quantum theory took a bunch of philosophical mistakes that classical physicists were making epistemologically and forced them to correct those mistakes by making particular kinds of physical observations impossible to do in a coherent and sensible way without realizing the mistakes and discarding them. And the interesting thing I think about that is that if we think in terms of the general philosophical ideas, the epistemological statements, they're not really specific to quantum mechanics. So we don't have to go through a whole litany of different ones, or at least we don't need to unpack them all today. But there are a few different things you could say about what's special, usually thought about with quantum mechanics. One of them is the idea of intrinsic randomness, that there's some things that when you measure them, it simply cannot be the case that there is a definite value of what you're measuring before you measure it, and it's somewhat unpredictable what result you're going to get. There's also the idea of there being trade-offs in how you measure things, that if you measure one thing, it might make it difficult for you to measure something else at the same time. There's also, as it happens, the idea of needing to define your whole system before you can make a measurement and before you can make predictions. You can't kind of take things to pieces in isolation. You really have to consider the whole system and all the different parts that could potentially interact, even if they're not currently interacting, in order to coherently define what you mean by making a measurement. So these are, you could list a bunch of things like this, and it's the philosophy of quantum mechanics. But if you talk to most physicists, I think what they would say is, these are things that are true about the world because quantum theories taught us that they were true. But before we discovered quantum theory, or before we did the experiments that kind of forced us to develop quantum theory as an explanation for those observations, there wasn't any particular reason to think of the world this way. And if you look back, a few centuries earlier to people like Laplace or Lagrange or Newton or Leibniz or whoever, that thinking of the world in those terms, physics sounds very different. It sounds like you just have, a cannonball, and at every moment and instant in time, it has some height off the ground, and you can write down equations that tell you exactly what the height is off the ground of the cannonball while it's flying through the air. And there's no contradiction with asking exactly how fast it's moving at the same time as you ask where it is, or how high it is off the ground. And so if we go to, and I don't want to accuse Newton, but let's say if we go to the gloss on Newtonian physics and the centuries of progress of classical mechanics that came before the advent of quantum mechanics, it seems like the world was described in terms that didn't have all of this quantum complicatedness. And then quantum theory jumps up and sort of bites you on the nose and says, no, haha, you thought it was simple, but it's actually more complicated, and physics is forcing this on you, and now you have to revise your philosophy. I would argue, however, that there actually are some fairly general, epistemologically appealing statements in some of the things that I just said about what quantum theory forces on you. Things like intrinsic partial unpredictability of the system at hand, or the need to stipulate or define how you're going to measure things and what you're going to measure before it can be stated what it's possible to measure in a system and what it might not be possible contemporaneously to measure in a system, or the need to define the boundaries of your system and the members of your system before you can coherently define what it is to make a measurement there. Those are things that actually in their own guise, in another guise, in their own way, also emerge in the messy complexity of life at the level of the human being. And in some ways, it was actually a philosophical mistake of early classical physics, where people were so impressed by the success of the mathematics that they had developed for describing a particular set of experimental systems and observations that they make in them, that they started to believe the math on the page was what was real, even though there's no reason to believe that in order to do science well. The fact that I write down an equation saying this is what the cannonball does not imply with certainty that the cannonball, so to speak, has a definite position if no one's measuring that position. What does it mean to say that that's true? It's a kind of an imposition of an additional mathematical mysticism on top of the sort of more workman-like way of approaching classical physics, where you could say, I have some equations and I write them down, and they help me to make predictions about what these measurements will be when I make them, with some perhaps distribution of possible outcomes based on other measurements that I made over here. And in between, if the equations say something is happening, that's interesting, or I can contemplate that, but that doesn't necessarily tie the world's hands in certain ways. And the reason I want to make that point is because I really think that across the length and breadth of what you encounter in, let's say, the worldview of Chazal, of the sages of the Talmud, and more generally, what comes through the teachings of the intellectual and spiritual fathers of our tradition, it seems to me that the epistemology forced on modern physicists by quantum mechanics really is something that would not have been uncomfortable as a set of ideas for Chazal. As I mentioned, things like the requirement of partial unpredictability when you're making observations and measurements, or the need to define a procedure of measurement carefully and to do so in a way that it defines the system at hand in clear terms, and the possibility that when making the measurement, you might actually be causing changes in the system that you're measuring and making it more difficult to measure other things, or causing things to go a different way than if you hadn't measured them. These are all things that actually in their own way come up to the surface over and over again across the length and breadth of Shas. And we can't obviously cover the length and breadth of Shas tonight, but I did want to make that prefatory comment because I think it is hiding in the background here of some of what we're going to talk about. So I'm not going to be saying, oh, well, because of quantum mechanical ghostliness and the mystical power of mathematics, that actually when you count people, things can happen to them. That's not what I'm going to be saying. What I do want to say, though, is that I think it has, since the inception of our tradition, and perhaps since the creation of the world, and it's the specification by Hakadosh Baruch Hu, in a sense of its fundamental ways of working, it has been the case that these kinds of uncertainties or these kinds of entanglednesses or ways that measurement can sort of become part of the system instead of just being a way of looking at it from the outside. That's always been how the world works. It's how it works at all different levels. And what we have in the example of quantum mechanics is just what happened when people tried to take the world apart into such tiny pieces that they wouldn't suffer anymore from all of those problems. And then physics reared up and sort of forced upon them that they had to continue to live with those same challenges and difficulties because there was this last trick it had to play, in the sense that even though you could keep on teasing things apart into tinier and tinier particles, it was not the case that doing so eliminated all of what you thought were the sources of unpredictability that you were previously contending with, right? So it turns out that shooting cannonballs is unpredictable. It also is true that shooting electrons is unpredictable to some degree. And there are other things that are quite predictable about each. And that's always, the epistemological position that we face, whether we are, so to speak, a halachic individual trying to assess the world as an Oved Hashem and trying to keep the Torah and making the observations and measurements necessary for that, or a physicist who's trying to make measurements and predictions of a more, let's say, mathematized and technical sort. So that's a long prefatory comment. So now let's get into our first source. The first source is the beginning of Parshat Kitisa, which we read for Parshat Shkalim, and it records the taking of a census through the contribution of a half shekel of silver as a contribution to the construction of the Mishkan and the Mikdash. So the idea is that everyone who's part of this people who are going to be building this house for HaKadosh Baruch Hu should equally contribute a certain amount. And it's not the only contribution that they make, and it's not the only kind of thing that's needed. But for this purpose, everyone makes the same contribution, which means that counting the amount of shkalim of silver that you have afterwards will tell you how many people you had. And there's a very curious statement that's made by the Torah itself. It begins at Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, ki tisa et rosh bnei Yisrael livkodehem v'natnu ish kofer nasho la'Adonai bifkodotam v'lo yihye behem negef bifkodotam. So when the Lord spoke to Moshe, saying, when you take a census of the Israelite people, according to their enrollment, each shall pay the Lord a ransom for himself on being enrolled, that no plague may come upon them through their being enrolled. So this is, let me find the right term, v'lo yihye behem negef. So the word here is negef, which is the same shoresh as magefa, plague, that we have in the present day. In Israel, you hear about the magefa, which is the pandemic we're contending with currently, so that there will not be a plague bifkodotam, when they are counted or when they are reckoned or enrolled, or however you want to translate that word. And there are different directions that you can go in with this. In one sense, if you're very familiar, or in a sense too familiar with various aspects of our tradition, one can read this and just say, well, the concern here is Ein Hara. Ein Hara is when somehow you're looking at things or counting them. There's kind of, for some reason, in our, the tradition we have from our sages, a sense in which that can be kind of dangerous or harmful. So in Talmudic physics, this is dangerous. In Tanakhic physics, in the biblical physics, this is dangerous. So in the sort of, in the framework of the world that the Torah lays out for us, we should think of this as being dangerous. And that's why it's talking about it, but we just move on and say, oh, so it's nice in this case that it's not dangerous because it's a mitzvah. And so HaKadosh Baruch Hu has commanded it, and when he commands us to do something that involves counting people, there's somehow kind of an exemption from the possible danger. But I think that we have to go in a few different directions from this. One of them is just to ask, well, why should something like this be dangerous? And are we going to give it a magical explanation? Meaning, are we going to say it is not comprehensible according to objectifiable rules by which the world seems to work, but it is in fact how the world works, and the Torah is telling us how it works, end of story. And so there are those who might go that way, or there are those who might say, this must be talking about something that is natural or sensible, but there isn't necessarily a clear explanation for that here, and maybe we don't need to worry about it, and we should just focus on the mitzvah. I'm interested in this because we live in an age where there's a lot of counting that goes on all the time of people and of lots of other things. And I am curious whether the Torah is telling us this is really a problem, like is counting people the same thing as pointing a loaded gun at them? Or if that's not true, if we can say, oh, well, no, of course, loaded guns actually are dangerous and counting people somehow has some other quality to it. What is the difference, right? How do we specify that? And what I want to try to argue to you today, I think could split into two streams. In one sense, I think that there's an epistemological aspect to this, which may go a layer too deep, and I don't necessarily want to belabor it too much, but where it is kind of about the quantum mechanical question, not actually about quantum mechanics, but about that kind of epistemology. The question of what is true about the world if we don't measure it, right? That if you're not making certain assessments and certain observations, is it still the case that those things are true, but you just haven't measured them? Or could it be the case that until you measure them, they don't become true? And if that's the case, then what kind of wiggle room does that leave for choices that people make about how they assess the world? Now, this is a very complicated subject because in some limit, you can turn it into a kind of a comedic, or not comedic is the wrong word, a risible position, a laughable position, because we can't exist in the world and function in the world imagining that the things we don't observe might not exist until we observe them, particularly because there's more than one of us. And there's a lot of different people who are observing different things all the time. And yet, when you go all the way to the other extreme and you start talking about the world as though there are all these numbers which are true about the world all the time, which are already what is going on in the world. And when we make measurements, what we're doing is kind of pointing a special device at the world and turning over a rock and finding out what that number is. There's also an epistemological problem with that, because how are those numbers true about the world until they're being measured? who says they're true? Who made them true? Where are they? Are they in a ledger somewhere? Are they recorded in any way? Can they differ depending on how measurements are made? And are all of them true depending on what choice we had made about how we're going to make the measurement? It starts to be very muddled, and not just because of questions about physics that you might raise if you were considering that we can think of the world as being made of stuff that has physical laws it seems to like to obey. But even leaving all of that aside, how many people are reading a book about Harry Potter right now in the world? Does anyone know? You can make estimates, right? You could perhaps take surveys, and perhaps that would change the system a little bit. You could put tracking devices on everyone to actually see whether they were doing this or not. There are a lot of different ways you could go about trying to make the measurement. But if you're not measuring it, is there a number, or is there just an estimate of a number, and there's no such thing as the true number until it's actually observed? So that's one kind of a direction we should take this in. Another one we should take it in is that counting people actually, because it involves procedures, sometimes, and indeed I think in this case may always involve gathering them and bringing them together. And that may be perhaps the most important point I want to try to get at today, which is that counting people is partly, in the view of the Torah, about bringing them together into one place. And I think in this era, we do not need much of a reminder of how gathering people together into places can be considered to increase the spread of infectious disease. And as a result, that is somehow a consideration when we are talking about the question of how we're going to count people. Because if we're going to count people by getting them to be shoulder to shoulder in a stadium, there may indeed be some kind of question about a plague that we would be asking ourselves, at least in this current moment, where everyone is being made to think very, very carefully about how many people are in a room of what size by governments and other factors, et cetera. So those are the two different streams that we can try to carry forward at a high level. And now we can talk about the specific sources a little bit more. So this first source is just, as I said, holding out the idea that there is in general seemingly a risk of plague from counting people, at least if the word we're using for counting is bifkod or poked, right? That we're counting them in a way that we have to flesh out the meaning of this way of counting. But that this particular way of counting people, where you have them give their half shekel of silver for the Mikdash, somehow is protected, and that people are not going to have to worry about this in the way they would have to worry if they somehow were counting people for some other reason. And that's the puzzle that we're going to try to carry forward and think about. So one thing that, and this is a source that was mentioned in a wonderful Machon Shilo shiur a few weeks ago by Rav Gabriel Martindale, which I really enjoyed and I highly recommend. This is a source from the Mishnah in Ta'anit, which talks about the question of, in halakha, what does it mean for there to be a plague in a city? And the operative point here is that in order for there to be dever, the word now is not being negef, but it's a different word. So maybe you have to worry about whether these are the same thing, but let's stipulate for the moment that we're talking about infectious disease. So dever and negef are synonymous. So if you're going to have dever in a city, then it needs to be that based on the population of the city, you need to have a certain number of people dying per day in that city in order for it to meet that criterion of being defined in halakha as a plague. So v'yatzur mimena shlosha metim b'shlosha yamim ze achar ze harei ze dever. So if in a city where we had a population of 500 able-bodied men, if 3 dead are taken out of it on 3 consecutive days, this is called pestilence. And this is of halakhic import because we're trying to decide whether we're going to start fasting and making extra tefillot. And so this is how we decide. So this particular source is, first of all, reminding us that at least in an operational sense, and in a sense that matters in halakha, there is no plague unless you count people, right? You cannot call it dever unless you have done the counting. And I think we usually, especially in this society with its ethos and its typical ways of thinking, I'm talking about the sort of global society, which is highly Hellenic, and therefore highly shot through with scientific ideas of ontological truths about the world that are true whether you are currently assessing them or not. That in this world, we tend to hear this and we think, well, whether or not there is a plague, that's something that's true regardless, right? But in order for us to follow a halakhic procedure, we need a criterion for deciding how to act. And so we make the measurement accordingly, and this is how we make our decision about how to act. But that wasn't really saying whether there's a plague or not in a ontological sense. It was just saying it in a halakhic sense, which is the one that matters for action in this case. So the question, though, is there a separate idea, according to the B'china, the sort of perspective of the Torah, of there being an ontological state of there being pestilence that is separate and different from the halakhic question of how you should act? And I will say that this is more complicated because, as we see in this Mishnah, the question here is about whether people should be fasting, and that is not the same thing necessarily as other kinds of decisions that you might make based on information. So the fact that we don't fast and make extra tefillot doesn't necessarily mean that there cannot be danger unless exactly this many people are dying or more per day in a city of a certain size. That being said, we're seeing in Chazal, we're seeing in the Torah Shebal Peh, in our oral tradition, in the Torah, more of this idea that even the very question of whether there is a plague is somehow related to the collection of data, to the counting of people. And I have to point out at this point that that really is no less the case today. And I don't mean to say that, let's say, viral infections would all go away with the snap of the fingers if we just stuck our heads in the sand and didn't observe anything or didn't make observations or didn't count things. We started here with a source showing us that it can be a mitzvah to count people. And that's an important thing to keep track of and to hold on to. So it may depend on your kavanah and the purpose with which for which you're counting people. That being said, it is also true, I think unassailably true, that how people behave and the degree to which they perceive danger and even the best attempts people make at quantifying the danger are very much not only molecular biological phenomena or cell biological phenomena or medical phenomena, they're also social phenomena. They're also, let's say, sociological or econometric phenomena, because what procedures exist to count people of certain kinds certainly can end up having an impact on the way information is distributed about a disease and people's perception of whether it is dangerous or not. And there's a whole lot of arguing that people can do in parsing the data differently. And that is a more elaborate way of stating the same point, which is that whether you count people or the way that you count people will have an impact on the social phenomenon of whether a plague is perceived. And not only that, even the medical phenomena of whether people die and in what numbers and how, right? Because you can change your policies based on the ways that you're counting and measuring, and things will happen differently. And there, again, still will be arguments amongst people about how many more people of one kind did not perish because a policy was made a certain way and we counted people this way, versus if we had counted people a different way and made a policy based on that counting in a different way. And maybe these other people who, as a result, maybe did die, now would be alive. And you can, in any version that you want of present day technology, talk about these differences in terms of who does testing and under what conditions and with what technology and according to what imposition of law or voluntarism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is something that I think if you had asked people 5 years ago, about this pasuk, or this passage, the several psukim in the Torah talking about counting people in the connection with plague, it would seem very weird and sort of like it fits into the framework of the inscrutable, quote unquote, physics of a text that talks about miracles and prophecy all the time, where we don't necessarily understand what the connection is. In the present day, I think many of us much more so can appreciate that when you count people and how, and according to what procedure and what requirements and what rules you make about how people must respond when they are counted a certain way, that will have a huge impact on whether people perceive the danger of an epidemic or a plague or not, on whether there is one or whether it goes away. And there are arguments of all different sorts that people might make about doing things one way or another. But these subjects are very much bound together. And that is quite a profound insight that the Torah carries to us from a very distant remove in time. And if we appreciate that about it, I think one of the things that's interesting is to take that back into the Torah and say, well, if that is part of what it's thinking about, then what is it trying to teach us about perhaps how we experience plagues and what the connection might be to Beit HaMikdash? Because that's the other thing that was in that first source, right? That it was mentioning that when counting people for the purpose of contributing to Beit HaMikdash, so Bnei Israel are pooling their wealth in equal measure in order to contribute to the construction of a physical dwelling for the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu on earth, in what would eventually be rooted in the spot on Har HaBayit in Yerushalayim. And that action, the Torah is telling us, is related somehow to this notion of counting people in plagues and protection from that. That's something that we should consider, not least because there's more support for that elsewhere in our tradition. And that's something we should go looking for now. If it were just one pasuk, then maybe you would say, okay, well, maybe they're related. Maybe in this instance, they're being mentioned together. But in fact, you see a quite striking reprisal of this theme in the life and times of David HaMelech, which is both written about in Sefer Shmuel and also in Divrei Yamim. So I have here the source from Divrei Yamim. I won't read the entire thing in Hebrew, mostly because my Hebrew is too slow to make that a good use of everyone's time right now. So I apologize, but I'll just pull out the relevant points, and I encourage people to look at this source, which is really a fascinating one. So David HaMelech decides to make a census of his people. And in Divrei Yamim, it's explicitly said, Vayamod Satan al Yisrael, V'yoset et David limnot et Yisrael. So an adversary or Satan arose against Israel and incited David to number them. So David tells Yoav to go and make a census, and Yoav does not want to do that, and is loath to do it, but he eventually complies. He counts the people. They number a bit more than 1 million, and also we're counting people who are ready, men who are ready to draw the sword. And it also mentions that Yoav did not count Levim or those from Shevet Binyamin, because this command from David had become repugnant to him, is the translation given. So that is the procedure that was just carried out. Yoav went around, he counted everyone, he left out some people because of his personal biases, which is an interesting point, right? Because already from the beginning, what we're seeing is counting people is a political process, and counting people is a process where interests in government or other interests that stand to benefit or not may have preferences for how people are counted and who gets counted and who gets left out, which is a very grown-up point that people sometimes forget when looking at data having to do with government statistics or whatever else. But there are interests that sometimes are served from counting people one way or another. In this case, the interest seems to be very simple. Yoav didn't want to count them. He didn't like these people, so he didn't count them. And then we we have the fulcrum of the plot, so to speak, in this passage, which is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not happy. Vayira b'nei Elohim al hadavar hazeh vayach et Yisrael. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not happy that David did this, and so he struck Israel. He struck the nation that David is leading, because David decided to count them without seeming to have a good reason. Like, presumably he had a reason, but we're not told the reason other than that it was a Satan. It was a sort of a adversarial malach or angel, or it was an actual adversary, who knows, but it was something that made him fearful, or that somehow made him want to measure his strength as the leader of a nation. But he didn't do that with the right kavanah. He didn't do it as a mitzvah to gather half shekels of silver for Beit HaMikdash. He didn't do it only to count the army, seemingly, at least according to, at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers in English, we're numbering those who are of the age of 20 who can go to the army. And that also was a commanded counting that we don't think of as being dangerous. So something in what David did had the wrong kavanah, and as a result, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is angry. And there's something so fascinating here that happens, which is that a Navi, here named Gad, comes to David and says to him, in the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because he's angered Hashem, he now must choose one of three different bad things to happen. So that's a very peculiar thing to be offered, because usually you think whatever is happening. And here, this is a bit of a hint of what we were talking about before, referencing this early discussion about the epistemology that sounds kind of quantum mechanical, but it really is more general, which is you can make a measurement and there can be different reasons that the measurement came out the way that it did. And in this case, one kind of way of reading this, which I find fascinating, is it's like saying that there's more than one possible interpretation to the same data. And the Navi is coming to David and kind of asking him, what would you like? What do you want this to mean? Do you want this to mean that it will be a 3-year-long famine? Or do you want this to mean that you'll be defeated by your adversaries with the sword for 3 days? Adversaries with the sword of your enemies overtaking you for 3 months? Or do you want 3 days of the sword of Hashem, of pestilence, of plague in the land, wreaking havoc throughout your land? So there are, first of all, there are different ways of looking at this, but first of all, there's a way of looking at this where you could say, in a sense, the fact that the number came in kind of low, right? That's all David knows right now. He knows that maybe he expected there to be more people. And because Yoav didn't count Levi and Binyamin, the number seems low to him. And now, what's it going to be? Is it going to be because there's already mass starvation going on and you're getting the first information of the effects being felt, right? That there isn't enough food? Is it because you're already being attacked? And somehow there's disruption that caused the counting to not fully succeed, or that people have already been killed, or whatever else? Or is it because there's a plague and people are dying, much in the same way that the source from the Mishnah, that if we're coming in low, maybe it's because a bunch of people are dying of disease. We take for granted in the present day that it's very easy to get lots of information everywhere all the time. Some of it more accurate than others, but in any case, a high volume of it. But for David HaMelech, even finding out something like there's a plague that's sweeping across the whole land, that is information that has to be integrated over time. So there isn't necessarily a plague yet, because he's being asked what interpretation he wants to give to the data. You also could say, on the flip side, maybe there's an interpretation of the situation that says there is a pathogen, right? There is a virus or whatever you want to call it, but there are different policies that David can choose, which will impose different kinds of suffering on his people, right? Because maybe you can stop the spread of disease if you tell everyone to stay in their house. And you the command of the king, stay in your house for a month. And then what do you get? Maybe you get a famine, right? Because no one goes out of their house. You devastate an agrarian economy that is much closer to the level of subsistence than we're used to in the present day. And you have mass starvation. So do you want to cause a famine for 3 years because you tell people to sit in their house for a month by order of the king? Or do you want to cause a war? Because that's another option, right? Maybe people won't stand for it. You'll tell people to sit in their house for a month and they'll say no. And they'll say, you're a bad king. And now I'm joining this faction of these people who never liked you to begin with. Perhaps in Shevet Binyamin, who didn't get counted anyway, right? So there's all sorts of different things that could happen as a matter of policy. Or do you want to just say, okay, let's let the famine rage? And the answer of David is quite interesting in regard to all of these possibilities, whether it's about what can be known and the different possible ways that an Oved Hashem receives information, and without yet knowing more or enough about the world to fully have a picture of what's going on, he doesn't assume he knows what's happening, and he's going to take an approach that doesn't necessarily, so to speak, constrain Hashem's hand. So there's an aspect of emunah, perhaps, in how David responds, and humility, and not pretending he can know what the number means, and that really you can have a lot of data and you can still not be sure what's going on. And then there's also an aspect of his not wanting to intervene with a strong hand, because what he says in response, after these possibilities are laid out to him, he says, let me fall into the hands of Hashem, for his compassion is very great, and let me not fall into the hands of men. So, Vayomer David el Gad, Tsar li me'od, Aplana b'yad Adonai, ki rabim rachmav, me'od, uv'yad Adam alepol. So, I don't want to fall into the hands of men, let me fall into the hands of Hashem, which I think is a beautiful response by David, and one, now that we're reading this somewhat with glasses to see connections to present events and challenges across the world for the last few years, there is great humility and great emunah and great confidence and faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu for David to say, I'm not going to pretend that I have the strength or that men have the strength to shape these events to their liking. And so this is something that we respond to not by trying to squeeze the world into a shape we want with all our strength, but rather by seeing it as a set of complex events whose outcome will ultimately be dictated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that we should be orienting ourselves towards him with our intention, our kavanah, in whatever we do. Now, that doesn't mean that we know everything that David does in response, right? The Tanakh is very sparing in what it tells us about what happens. And so the difference in his eyes between falling into the hands of men and falling into the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu may not be as stark a difference as doing absolutely nothing to stem the spread of plague versus other things. But in the other possibilities that we laid out, we at least notice that there's this hint, perhaps, that he could have chosen to make this a war. He could have chosen to make this a famine, but he didn't, because what happens is it becomes a plague. His unwillingness to take a strong hand in the way he intervenes makes it a plague, and people get sick. But there are other kinds of damage or other kinds of suffering that could have happened that seem somehow to have been more his to choose, and that's not what he chose. So it is notable that Melech HaMashiach, the quintessential Oved Hashem, David HaMelech, makes this choice in this situation, trying to be the emblem of both emunah and faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the creator and judge of the world on the one hand, and also as a political leader who wields military power and sees himself as responsible for his flock be'olam hazeh, in this world. That this is the choice he makes. So there's a plague, and it rages on, and various other events happen. So this kicks off the period during which there's a dever, and in which 70,000 men, we're told, perish, according to this last pasuk in this third source here from Divrei Yamim. If we flash forward to later on in the same passage in Divrei Yamim, now I just want to make the point about this connection to Mikdash, the connection to Har HaBayit, specifically the Temple Mount, and the way that the plague ends. Because seemingly unrelatedly, if we didn't have other reason to hold these two things alongside each other, David, who is interested in the future and is building the future for the nation that he's leading, and he's always thinking about the house that must be built for HaKadosh Baruch Hu and will be built by his son Shlomo, he acquires a threshing floor from Ornan the Arnon or Arwana. There are different names that he's given in different passages, but he acquires the threshing floor on Har HaBayit from this Jebusite or Yevusi named Arwana or Arnon, and he buys it, and he builds an altar there. Vayivin sham David mizbeach l'Adonai v'ya'al olot ushlamim vayikra el Adonai v'ya'aneu ba'esh min hashamayim al mizbeach ha'ula. So he makes burnt offerings to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Har HaBayit, and he calls in the name of Hashem, and Hashem answers him. Vayomer Adonai lamalach, and Hashem said to the angel, which is the angel that was walking around with its sword killing people. This was the plague. So Hashem said to the malach, but it's sort of like with Kain and Hevel, it's broken off. It doesn't say what he said. Vayishev chaubo el nidana. So the angel returned his sword to its sheath. So where we land is that David acquires Har HaBayit as a place for making burnt offerings to Hashem, and starts laying the foundations of the building of the temple that will eventually be carried out by Shlomo after him. And this is the moment where HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides, and where Divrei Yamim chooses to tell us that the plague was ended. Now, does that mean that the Torah is telling us, or that Tanakh is telling us, that anything to do with Har HaBayit and Beit HaMikdash has a magical power to stem the spread of disease, and we just need to go and do things there, and we don't have to worry about other things that are connected to disease that we get from other perspectives? I don't think so. First of all, because I think in general, one gets much less out of what Torah is trying to teach us by explaining away things that it puts there for us as having incomprehensible mechanisms that we shouldn't bother thinking about. It teaches us much more if we try to understand how what it's saying could be true. And also because there's a very clear danger that the prophets of Tanakh rail against in thinking of the temple as just a magical form of protection. You know, you win all your wars, you have great agriculture, and you're spared disease because you go and you make some offerings on this magical mountain, and then you can go and enslave each other and murder and steal, and it's not a big deal, right? We read all these passages elsewhere in Nevi'im that are saying that the Navi is expressing the idea, whether in Amos or Yeshayahu, that what is it with all of these rituals and all of these korbanot? What is the point of them if you're not doing other things that also matter, that are also part of the Torah? So I don't think that the Torah is trying to teach us that we should treat Mikdash like a magical amulet that protects us from things because of rituals that we do there. Chas v'chalila. However, that being said, all of that being said, it is nonetheless the case that the Torah is trying to talk to us about Mikdash and Dever or Negev, plague, Magefa, right? The notion of an infectious pestilence or plague is being juxtaposed in the Torah itself. And there are other places that we could look, but we won't go to them today. It's being juxtaposed in the Torah itself, and also much more explicitly being reprised in a lengthy passage that is all about the question of counting people and about disease and about Mikdash, and how they're all rolled up together in one issue that you should contemplate as one concept. So I've run out in a lengthy way, so I'm going to be very brief with some of these other sources that I put in here to get to the main point I want to make, and then we can have a little bit of a discussion. I mentioned these other sources here at the bottom because they're about the word pakad. What does it mean, bifkodotam, that if there's supposed to be some risk of plague, what is counting actually? And I think that you can look to the context of usage of meaning, you can look to the context of usage for meaning of words in Torah. And it's interesting that pakad, we often translate it as accounted, or counted, or numbered, or remembered. And a famous use, for example, is Adonai pakadet Sarah, when Sarah was finally given her pregnancy with Yitzchak Avinu. It was like Hashem was remembering her or counting her. But I think even in that case, and in various other uses of this root for counting, I think the common theme is that you're putting people together in a group of people. So it's not just that they're being counted sort of with a finger pointed at them, so to speak, or that a number was put on them. It's that they've somehow been gathered, perhaps more or less physically, depending on the usage of the term. But for example, Sarah is actually being accounted directly following the healing of a whole bunch of women that she had joined in the harem of Avimelech when she was kidnapped there, right before this pasuk, Adonai pakadet Sarah, kasher amar vayas Adonai leSarah, kasher diber. So the notion is that she is being accounted with this root pakad in a way that groups her together with other women that she actually consorted with and was in the same place as it happens. And they actually had the same problem that she did, which is that they couldn't bear children. And they together were accounted. And you see many other instances where it's about sort of gathering the people together, like in the Exodus from Egypt, for example. So I think you can argue this from many of the sources where you see this root appear. And I think the point is therefore that bifkodotam is not just saying you're going to get a bunch of money and it'll be in a big pile and you'll have the abstract ability to measure how many people there are. It's about gathering people together. And the Mikdash is that. The Mikdash is about gathering people together in one place, right? It is the place where Hashem has decided to put his name. And what makes it that place is that it is the place where people come to bring their korbanot for their shlamim offerings, their offerings of, let's say, thanksgiving, or with a desire to commune with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, their chatat offerings, their offerings that demarcate that they have committed a sin or done something wrong. It's also a place where people come 3 times a year for Shalosh Regalim, right? It's a place where there's a special national obligation to gather in this one place and on this one mountain, and in Yerushalayim, and then to bring offerings and to bring all the different fuels of commerce, money and food and animals, etc., produce, to bring it all together in one place so that Yerushalayim can be a bustling city with a much greater population density than usual, so that Har HaBayit can be a place where people are packed in so that they can be there for Korban Pesach or whatever else. So over and over again, in the actual functionality of Mikdash, it is about gathering people together and bringing them into one place. And that on its own would be a reason to think this is in some sense dangerous. And I mean, we live in an era today where we have the luxury of worrying about an infectious agent such as coronavirus, which obviously is capable of putting life in danger, but it clearly can't compare to, let's say, the bubonic plague. I think it has to be thought of as automatically, to anyone who has a concept of infectious disease being a transmissible thing where you're more likely to contract it as a result of gathering together in one place with other people. kal v'chomer, that it would be, there'd be some kind of danger associated with that. And so at least one of the things that I think we're seeing in this connection between Mikdash and census and disease is that many of the rights and many of the obligations associated with the Mikdash involve taking people from all over the land and packing them together into one city or onto one mountain. And by doing so, you perhaps are arguably increasing the risk of something. And what the Torah is telling you by creating this juxtaposition here is that there is a point at which we always have to ask ourselves, when is it worth it for people to gather together, right? Why should Am Yisrael in particular, because that's what the Torah is talking about here, why should Am Yisrael gather together in one place? There are lots of different reasons to gather together, and sometimes people do it for entertainment of a more sort of secular sort. Sometimes people do it for smachot, life cycle events, where there are times of rejoicing for a wedding, for a brit milah. Sometimes people do it to do korban pesach or some other mitzvah commanded in the Torah. And the Torah is trying to give us a compass and orient us and help us to think this through and say, look, there will always be a choice to make about whether people gather together or not. And there will always be an argument to be had about when those gatherings are worth it or not, depending on what impact they have on human health. That has been part of the human condition since time immemorial. And it is not necessarily the case that the answer is always just to say, let's pretend disease doesn't exist and act as though we're completely oblivious. And in fact, there's a very subtle treatment of this question in the Talmud, and its discussion. I believe it's in Masechet Shabbat. I looked at the source before, but I didn't get into this source sheet about bloodletting as a medical practice on different days of the week and what astrological dangers obtain on different days. And then there's this comment about bloodletting on Wednesdays, that it's dangerous because the planet Mars is in ascendance. However, people do this so much that Hashem has rachamim on simple people, right? And it quotes a pasuk from Tehillim. So there's this idea that if people don't know something is dangerous for them, then they can trust in the rachamim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If they know something is dangerous for them, it might not be the case that they can just simply trust in his rachamim, because maybe they're experiencing danger for the wrong reason, right? Maybe they are cramming themselves into a dangerously small space without the right kavanah, and they could be doing something deadly or at least not worth it as a result, depending on the exact factors of the situation or the circumstances. However, there are things that the Torah is teaching us are definitely worth it and are definitely things that we need to make a priority. And it starts with the idea of Mikdash. It starts with the idea that if you're going to do one thing to gather everyone together and experience that risk, perhaps, it will be in order to build a house for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because that is the place that David acquired, where he made offerings on that mountain, and Hashem chose then to have his rachamim on his people in their time of pestilential danger, because he was making a point to us, which is that when plagues come and when they go, it is not simply a matter of what is in our hands. It is always in his hands. And there are things that he wants us to do with our efforts here on earth that are about protecting life and being cautious. And there are also some things he wants us to do here on earth that are about our relationship with him. And if he has given us mitzvot to seek that relationship, then they cannot be discarded because people have new ways of counting each other that fill them with fear. And so that was what I wanted to finish with, and hopefully there's a little bit of time for discussion.
Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Hi there, everybody. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Yossi Edry from Katsrin. I just wanted to say hello. And
How are you?
we're working on an initiative called the Sanhedrin Initiative. There was a Sanhedrin initiative like 15 years ago with Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, and we're trying to refresh the whole operation. So yeah, we're busy with all that stuff.
An amazing group. I met with them when they were here in Nachlaot. And when you look at Torah, the Torah world is a large corporate structure. Everybody's sort of in a turf war to build their own institutions and their own collections and stuff. But when I got to talk to people who were part of the who had gotten through the real smicha of the Sanhedrin group, it was a total inversion. Everybody was saying, it's like, maybe you're more qualified than I am and you'll take my seat, because the level of responsibility was just infinite that was sitting on everybody's head. It was an amazingly interdisciplinary group, in addition to all of their other qualifications in Torah. Something that's just inconceivable when you look at anywhere else in the ordinary Torah world. You run across some people who are really, tzaddikim and stuff, but this was a level of responsibility which was so weighty that people took it at a very different tone to it. I hope you succeed in this. It's at least none of the Gedolim objected to this thing starting off, however long it'll take.
Yeah, it's a big deal, and I'm here with some of my partners in this operation. First of all, thank you for the share, Jeremy. Your share was very nice, and it does bring a lot of points. And bringing people together, like even counting the Sanhedrin, I was thinking in my mind while you were speaking about counting. When we speak about a magefa, a spread of a virus, every person has his ways of avodat Hashem, and if you bring 70 people together, you can imagine that there's also, you run the risk of like technically a magefa of like, oh, you believe in this, that's not the way I serve Hashem, like that kind of friction that might come up. Like that's what I was thinking of when you were speaking about that. The lo yeh b'hem negef. Hopefully, when you have different kinds of Yidden, Litvisher, Sephardish, Ashkenaz, Chabad, whatever, Kippah Sruga, all the different mixes, especially if they're going to come together for a Sanhedrin kind of thing, that they're going to be able to stand each other. It says that when Mashiach comes, they all stand in a chuppah and they can't leave because they get fire. But hopefully, when on this world, in this case, we'll be able to withstand each other and be able to pull it off. It's a big deal, but I think also it's important now, in connection with everything about the Magefa, we need to twist, like you said, the narrative to building the Beis Hamikdash, and of course, Binyan Beis Habchira. Before that, you need to have a Melech, and before a Melech, you need to have a Sanhedrin. Ein memanin Melech ela al pi Sanhedrin shel shivim, like the Rambam said. So let's hope that this is the right step, the first step that will take us from the Paz to the Taryag, and allow Hashem's allow the Shechina to come down that we get when we Mekayim a mitzvah. Be'ezras Hashem.
So, Dr. England, there was a few thoughts that I had about what you were saying. First of all, I was thinking about that when you count for the sake of a census, it seems like a more passive type. It's like being counted, as opposed to passively, as compared to when Jews get together for a minyan, or to build the Beit HaMikdash, or to gather in the Beit HaMikdash, where we're not just being there passively, we're it's sort of, we're being counted. It's sort of, maybe you could look at it as though we're being counted as opposed to counting ourselves. We're being counted by Hashem. In other words, Hashem counts us as part of the minyan. Hashem counts us as we're gathering the Mikdash or building the Beit HaMikdash. And also, on another level also, just like Hashem judges the world based on the majority, is there a majority that's doing good or not, or is that majority not there? Well, how does Hashem, in other words, that's based on the concept of Hashem looking at the world and seeing what the numbers are. How does it add up?
Yeah, well, I think you're definitely right that there is this notion of the kavanah of the action being performed, the intention of the action being performed, being rolled up into the procedure of measurement, particularly in this case in Parshat Shkalim, because you're not actually counting people by tapping them on the head. You're counting their contribution of silver of equal weight to the construction of the Mishkan. And so the thing that actually can be counted isn't simply a measure of presence or absence of a person. It's a measure of presence of a person who intentionally contributed some of their wealth to a specific effort and engaged in that action. And so I do think it's certainly right that there are different ways of counting people, and there's countings that we make, and then there's countings that HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes, and they're not always, the same, and people have different ways, to make themselves be counted, and they're not all equally good or the right move in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So I don't know how David was counting people exactly. The procedure isn't described in detail, but it seems that somehow the way that he went about it caused some kind of problem. I think at some point I was talking about that same source a while ago with someone, and then he pointed out, which I thought was a really nice idea as well, that even the taking of the census itself could have, in a sense, been the cause of the problem in a more direct way, that a person who goes from place to place in that era, could be bearing an infectious disease from one tribe to another, right? That in order to do the counting, Yoav had to travel around with his troop or whatever and go from one place to another. And that may have facilitated the spread of something. And it could also be a spread of something that attacks agriculture and causes a famine. It could also be a spread of ill report that causes a war, or it could be the cause of a pestilence. And so again, what the Navi comes to say is sort of, you did the wrong thing, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu isn't happy, but there's more than one thing that could happen as a result of this. And it kind of gives you this chance to look before the curtain is drawn back, and have a sense of multiple possibilities being supported by the present data, and perhaps not yet having been decided by HaKadosh Baruch Hu until David makes his decision.
Can I insert a question, comment or so? All the way back to your introduction, I stopped taking notes after I realized I would take up more than an hour to comment. So just take the first ones from, in terms of the way Chazal looks at data, from the opening of Bruchas, where you see that you have Bein Hashmashot, and whether you have night vision or day vision, whether the rods and cones of the retina go on or not, we look at models very differently. That we look at models as having asymmetries and having areas of indeterminacy, which is the whole Bein Hashmashos problem. It's like you don't declare that it's daytime because I don't see three medium-sized stars. You can't invert the description. So the way we build models is very different than the way they're built in physics, which is according to what we're able to measure, and how we can measure the data. The stuff that we haven't been able to measure, the next couple of decimal points or whatever it is in the experimental data, the uncertainty factors don't factor into our trying to scale up equations. And so that just there's two parts. So the way we look at measurements in Chazal, and the way physicists look and engineers look at measurements is really slightly different. In the scientific world, we tend to oversimplify because that gives us a grasp of something. Anyway, on the other side, you have in Masechet Kinim, you have a system which has innate entanglement in the definitions. And finding the first boundary condition is a relatively easy problem, but thereafter it goes very, very NP or worse in terms of complexity. So the models that we're looking for in contemporary physics are already really sitting there in Rabbi Yehuda's compilation of an encyclopedia of structures of thinking. Yeah, he uses examples in halacha because it's also a textbook that's for kids starting off age 10 to 15, but it doesn't stop there. So he really has an encyclopedia of structures of thinking, and these structures are already well established by the time of the Mishnah. That's one part. Another part is back to the Beis Hamikdash. Threshing floor is a rather peculiar example. It's a place where it's worth everybody to schlep their produce up there, because that's a place where there's always a wind that you can separate the grain from the chaff. Okay, and so to put a mizbeach there is to make a public announcement for anybody who can see that far, that the smoke rises instead of getting dispersed. In other words, it's an open advertisement for something. Mm-hmm. It's not just that he bought the threshing floor. There are other reasons why it's there. So David HaMelech doing this is really making a public declaration in a way that everybody can see. It's not just a proclamation of words. It's by act, you can see that something different is going on. With regard to the public gathering in Beis Hamikdash, there are various practices, I think, in India and China of using incense in hospitals or places where people are sick, because the composition of the incense encapsulates particulate in the air, and therefore the air is relatively sterile and is not as susceptible to transmission of infection as it would be if the incense wasn't there. So there's a lot there, on the other side of what you're getting to. There's a lot of public health regulations that percolate all through Chazal. Okay, and the back to this point that Yichai was talking about in the Sanhedrin, the whole halachic system is trying to help people with best practices advice to avoid certain kinds of risk, which starts with physical health and mental health and so forth. But when you switch over to the Malchut, the kingship, the king is authorized to override the Sanhedrin and declare that a national policy requires taking certain risks. And so this dilemma that what was the kavanah of David HaMelech and so forth is, it didn't rise to the level where it would be necessary for him to make the determination to take a risk or not. That's the problem with the Malchut there. Okay, it's a thread that runs through this whole thing. To go back, but to compare the Torah Moshe to the rest of Tanakh is a very different set of problems. The one who really talks about it in detail is Avram Geiger. On the one side, he was the principal student of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, which means he's a brilliant Talmud Chacham sitting in Frankfurt in 1860s. And then he breaks off from Shimshon Raphael Hirsch to join the Reform, and he becomes the ideological base. So his look ahead was totally messed up. He says he's sitting in Frankfurt, the Enlightenment is here, and when we're seeing the dismantlement of anti-Semitism, he's wrong. He thinks his followers are all going to be big Talmidei Chachamim like him. He was wrong. But his look back on what was going on in Chazal is worth a reading. And one of the things that he stresses very much is that when you read Pesukim, or when you read Mishnah, or when you read Gemara or anything, you have to try to appreciate what they were saying at the time it was written. So when you're reading Torah Moshe, you're reading what would it say to an ordinary scholar at the end of the Bronze Age. Okay, when you're reading Mishnah, it's what does it say to an ordinary scholar after we've already gone through this whole civil war issue of Hellenism, and we're still already sitting in Galut. You just can't. It's wonderful from the pulpit to make everything relevant, but if you really want to dig into what's going on, you have to go back into each time period, what it would have been saying at the time it was recorded.
So and you've said a number of different things. I'd love to try to respond to a few of them, maybe working backward. I think with the last point, I agree absolutely that there's an important element of the meaning of any part of our tradition that we study where we can understand a lot about it by trying as best we can to situate it in the time and place where it was given. And yet also, I think that that would be limiting if that were all we did. Yes. And so I totally agree that it should be part of how we read it. But given that there's a way of also reading everything in the world as, let's say, a text written by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, I don't think it's beyond him to keep it relevant to other generations, and that meaning is also there for us to access. Going further back, and I'm sorry if I'll miss some of these things. Maybe I'll lead back to the first one. As far as measuring things, I agree with you that physicists and engineers and scientists today like as much as possible to not have to think about measurement the way that Chazal did. But I think that's because there is this desire to try to make the procedures as objectively reproducible as possible, to the point where you idealize the notion of being able to forget that a measurement is actually much more like a halacha than it is a magical device that you point at the world that gives you a perfect number. And in fact, the advent of modern physics, special relativity, general relativity, quantum mechanics, that was all triggered by some people thinking very carefully about how you actually have to devise a procedure of measurement in order to measure certain things when you're doing very unexpected and weird and otherworldly activities. Like if you're moving near the speed of light, how would you still make a measurement, right? Thinking about that forced Einstein to think through the question of what it means to measure the length of something in a way that has currency no matter what speed you're moving at. And then lo and behold, you discover special relativity that way. So
Lorentz transformations and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm saying that I don't necessarily think it's a distinction we should say is qualitative and that it's a different activity in either case. I think it's more that Chazal were very hard-nosed about defining procedures of measurement so that you can never sweep the bump under the rug away and hide from yourself that this is a procedure with a set of criteria that a person will judge, and that numbers are not things that are sort of out there floating in the ether. They're things that people utter about the world after agreeing on a procedure for how to make ultimately subjective judgments about when those numbers seem sensible. And that really isn't less the case even with, gravitational wave measuring devices. It's just that it's a much more complex process of social agreement that it's built in many layers to get to. And the other thing I would say about incense in the Mikdash is that I could very well believe there are all sorts of things that the Torah commands us to do, which it's possible to scientize a side product of what we are doing, and believe perhaps that it has an impact viewed through the lens of, let's say, a more sort of medical or physical description. But I don't think we would want to say that we burn the Ketoret, the incense in the Mizbach Ketoret in Beit HaMikdash in order to prevent the spread of infection. And I also would not want to expose myself to the danger that someone could disprove that, right? Because it might be that sounds reasonable, but someone else could come along and say, well, we looked at this really carefully, and wherever they are burning incense in hospitals, it's not really making a difference. And it wouldn't here either. And I don't think that would undermine or that it should undermine our sense that there is a purpose to mitzvot like those. So I don't disagree about the possibility, but I don't think we should hang our hat on it. And there was almost maybe the most interesting thing to respond to was the one I'm forgetting that was somewhere in there. But
entanglement.
Just about entanglement. I think I wouldn't be the only person to observe this, but in a sense, quantum entanglement, which one has to have a longer conversation about, is easiest to talk about in contractual terms. And so I think you're right that conditional relationships that are described in terms of contracts are just a more flexible framework for describing relationship between states that we ascribe to different parts of the world. And for that reason, you cannot talk about quantum entanglement using the mathematics of Newtonian mechanics because it's too limited, but you can talk about something like entanglement using the language of contracts. And so it becomes perforce the case that to the degree that Chazal were very interested in all the logical structures that can be explored using contracts, that they have a more expressive framework within which to encompass various things. And one of the things you can capture if you want is something like quantum
Masechet
entanglement.
Kinim is a much richer model that has nothing to do with contracts. If you have an even number of korbanot that you're bringing, half of them should be used as chatat and half of them should be used as ola. So as soon as you use half of them as chatat, by default, the rest of them have to be used as ola. And it goes through a bunch of different conditional problems of how you navigate through this entanglement set when things get messed up, how far you can go before you risk making a mistake.
Sure, yeah. No, so I agree. I think it's part of the same category in the sense that it's about a procedure of logical rules for ascription of a property to a part of the world. And whether you're doing it in contracts or whether you're doing it in a procedure of classification needed, for example, for korbanot, you have this expressive flexibility that you don't have necessarily with F equals MA. And so there are things that can happen in that space of logic that look much more like some of what you get when you play around with these kind of toy models of quantum entanglement that people like to talk about in quantum mechanics.
Early in the shiur, I'm just going to throw this out there. I hope that this doesn't sound ridiculous. I don't know why, but it came to my mind this idea from Breslov and from Rabbi Nachman me Breslov, where he talks about how you can, when a person looks at the good points in another person, that they're actually causing that other person to become better, which was, I was thinking in some way relates to what you're talking about, that in other words, a person, when they're judging the other person, is essentially measuring them. And this is maybe an example of where the measuring changes the reality. But I have no, again, I really don't know to what extent that statement by Rabbi Nachman is reflective of Chazal, or...
Well, you can find things in Chazal. I don't know if there's something that parallels exactly that, but the idea, for example, of Hezek Raya. So Hezek Raya is the notion that maybe you could cause harm by looking at something. And it's discussed, I think, in Masechet Bava Batra, about sort of, if you look at your neighbor's field, could it be that you're going to cause damage to your neighbor's field by looking at it? And that sounds similar. You're going to look at it and say, oh, it looks like he's not getting much grain this year. And maybe if you hadn't looked, it would be better. And there are other statements like that Akadosh Baruch Hu blesses a man when he's standing alone in his field. That something about the eyes of everyone on something changes what it's possible to say about it. And I think you could take more or less radical epistemological positions about that, because I think it's both true that sometimes the eyes of others put parts of the world in danger or lower their quality because of a kind of a social phenomenon of a lowest common denominator, where the more people are looking at something, the more likely someone's going to find a problem with it, or the more constrained it is by what people think of as being objectively possible and impossible. And there's an example like this in Masechet Nida, where there's a husband and wife who are having trouble finding a time to be intimate with each other, and they're told by the Rav to go down by the river so that that the wife does her immersion in the river, and that they should be intimate there, because it was the jealousy of other women in the village that was, in their eyes, so to speak, that was, causing their problem. That there was something about making an assessment of someone's state of nidah too objective and too subject to objective general scrutiny would create too much of a problem. And so I think there's that aspect of the social phenomenon of, let's say, jealousy or nitpicking. But I also think there's the more radical idea that there are things about the world that simply don't need to be nailed down yet, because they sort of haven't been looked at. And we at least are enjoined by the tradition sometimes to relate to the world in this sense of how olam nivra bishvili, like the world is created for me. And so before counting your grain, you're supposed to say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu. You're supposed to say, Yehi ratzon milfanecha, Hashem Elokai ve'Elokei avotai, shetishlach hatzlacha u'veracha l'ma'aseh yadai. That you should send, that Hashem should send blessing to the labor of your hands, and then you count your grain. And so there's one perspective where you'd say, well, your grain is whatever it is, and that doesn't make a difference. Or you could say also, there's no such thing as the number of grains that you have until you count them. And before you make that assessment and you nail down that part of the world, because no one knows what it is yet, you have the right kavanah. You acknowledge that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one that decides the outcomes of observations. And you make that observation with the right attitude. And then you accept what it is from his hand. So it doesn't always magically make you have more grain as a result, but it does change your relationship to the result of the observation. I have to apologize, but I think I'm going to need to run off. But this has been a wonderful discussion, so thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. England, for your time. And thank you to everybody else that participated, and thank you to everybody and to Mr. Chef for his very interesting comments.
Here,
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.